Welcome to MetaPod, the podcast where we discuss operational execs and organizations that make and move stuff, and our common headaches, digital transformation, the forever labor shortage, and doing more with less. And now, the host of MetaPod, Ron Crabtree.
Welcome back, Meta friends, to part 2 of our series on tariffs and the consideration companies are dealing with. Today, we're doing a deep dive into an organization's readiness for tariff-driven relocation or diversification. I'm excited to have Bez Hoxha with us today as he's been living this tariff discussion for a while now. Bez, can you kick us off by telling our audience a bit about yourself and why you're an expert on executing the strategy around relocation and diversification?
Great. Thank you so much, Kim. Thanks so much for having me. A little bit about me. My name is Bez. I'm a management consultant with a focus on operational strategy, technology readiness, and process optimization, especially for companies navigating the geopolitical and market disruptions. Lately, my work has centered on supply chain risks, particularly in the U.S. drone and aerospace sectors, where tariffs on the Chinese-made parts, sensors, chips, and flight controllers have had upending procurement models.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Now, I know you've got this 5-phase system that you take companies through when they're considering doing something of this magnitude. Could you share that with our audience?
Great. Yes, absolutely. As far as having a broad framework on what we focused on and the 5 critical steps, first and foremost is actually quantifying the exposure on the hit of the market. So that is modeling the financial impact, looking at how tariffs affect your cost of goods, lead time, and margins. For example, with the current drone imports, we saw 40 to 6 market erosions depending on different scenarios. Secondly, is actually evaluating the strategic alternatives as far as finding another supply chain alternative. That's exploring options from nearshoring, joint ventures, alternative suppliers that are offshore or outsourced, or even changing the final assembly locations. And the current drone project we're working on for one of our clients, we've benchmarked 4 different regions that are strategic to the US and that will also pass compliance. Thirdly is actually mapping the operational dependencies. So identifying what parts of the supply chain are flexible and what could we break off and shift into. And also thinking about IP licensing, battery certification, and chip sourcing. Fourthly is actually running run risk scenarios on the risk management. What happens if export licenses get delayed or local talent isn't well trained or certified? These all need to be addressed and stress tested. And lastly, and fifth, is the aligning the legal and compliance frameworks. That is regulatory, IP protection, and customs laws should be front-loaded, not afterthoughts.
Great. So what would you say are the 3 to 5 steps that the organization should consider when they're considering these types of strategies to manage that supply chain, any supply chain disruptions? So within your framework, what would be those 3 to 5 steps?
Yeah, if we look at from the lens of looking the roadmap of operations and how it actually fits in with compliance, first and foremost would look at decision-making validation. Is relocation even viable? What are the exposures? We need to validate the continued improvements or the improvements on those imports whenever they're coming from different locations. Another step to look at is strategic alignment, getting all the stakeholders in line from all the financing, the investors, the engineering, and of course, once again, the legal. And the legal part plays a big role onto the regulatory agencies. We scope out the U.S. export laws, the FFA rules, as well as any restrictions if these drones will be used for either civil purposes or defense purposes, which even has way much more stringent regulations. These all need to touch up on the procurement side. And lastly, of course, before you roll out, looking at the operational setup from security facilities and the onboarding and aligning all the technologies will fit into the whole entire system on the operational side.
Right. You mentioned legal, and you're the first person that's really talked about the legal issues of that. What does a company need to do from that perspective? Like who do they tap into to make sure that they're adhering to those legal requirements?
Well, that's a really great question, Kim. I think it's always important to get legal advice from a legal firm that actually has uh, regulatory experience and also has done work like this before. And the reason is because there's quite a lot of regulatory blind spots that we've noticed. Sometimes companies might shift manufacturing without realizing the strict import control laws. Another part is the IP leakage. If your contracts might have an oversight and aren't airtight, you risk exposure to proprietary system if you're outsourcing into another country where you then might have issues with your IP leakage. For example, what happened with Coinbase for one of their representatives was leaking information that cost them a huge $400 million cybersecurity issue. It's a different industry. However, the IP leakage is the same risk. And lastly is the myopia of the logistics and how that actually might impact the overall certification for each one of the components of the drone, which need to be certified before they actually come into the US.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. What are some of the things that could go wrong and need to be anticipated when they're planning these types of strategies?
Well, some of the key blind spots that we look at to have a great mitigating risk strategy is first and foremost looking at if we are trying to fill in that market gap by looking at alternative supply chain sources. First and foremost, we need to look at, once again, as I said, typical blind spots are cultural and workforce integration. If you're partnering up abroad, making sure that that culture with the JVs is fits in with our U.S. culture, as well as the stakeholders, especially the shareholders, are in agreement. Looking at government buy-in as a stakeholder, getting their perspective on what will be acceptable or not. So ensuring that whoever you are selling to, whether it's the FAA or the DoD or civil societies, there's different drones for different purposes. Or if you're more on just the industry commercial zone, having that buy-in from each one of your end clients is probably very important to ensure that they are okay pre pre-market move with the decisions you're making. And of course, at the end of the day, you also want to have a good strategy for communication. Even though the current tariffs are being pushed by the current administration, where we want to produce more drones internally, the realistic aspect is that we're not ready for such a move because manufacturing drones here in the US will be significantly expensive. So even if that is the long-term strategy, I feel that having incentives or some sort of freeway from the government where we can actually focus on short-term strategies where we can alternatively outsource in areas where China does not have an impact or areas that are not China would be great in order for the companies to still be sustainable in the business market. And then long term, each company or OEMs or for different parts components or even developing and building drones can then build their own infrastructure and facility and distribution channels. So it's short-term, mid-term, long-term strategies that all need to take a look at.
Awesome. So, we all know that some of the best learning comes from failures. Can you share an example of intention around tariff that ended up being disastrous and how it could have been avoided?
That's a great question. And definitely, before we started working with this current client at the moment, we wanted to take a look at some previous case scenarios, perform a case analysis and some benchmarking to see where some areas and pitfalls that could potentially occur. And in one specific case that we outlined and emphasized this with this US aerospace firm that moved their drone assembly to the Southeast Asia. This was just recently, 2024, even before the tariffs. And they wanted to dodge certain other obligations, of course. But I feel like from what we noticed, they rushed in and they skipped a lot of the legal diligence and were blindsided by a lot of the export controls laws on avionics, whether where they're built and how they can actually be imported into the US. We realized that when we did the whole entire analysis on policy and regulations, that within 6 months, the licensing for these companies were delayed because they did not take the appropriate due diligence. They had investors panicking, shareholder pressure, and they had to unwind their whole entire facility in Southeast Asia at a loss. This could have been avoided by bringing in export control experts upfront, piloting out a rollout in phases, not all at once, and also treating the legal and compliance parts as part of your core ops teams and not in silos.
Interesting. Thank you for that. That was quite a disastrous execution, wasn't it? So that
Yep.
pretty much wraps up my questions today. Is there anything else you would like to share before we close today?
No, I just want to say thank you so much for having me, Kim. It was a pleasure, and see you all soon.
And so, just what one more thing I want to share is that if you'd like to connect with Bez, you can do so at MetaExperts portal. Just go to metaexperts.com. That's METAEXPERTS.com, and click on Find a Meta Expert. And then in the keyword search bar, enter Bez. He's certain he's the only Bez in the area, and I'm sure of that too. Or you can give a call to 734-425-1455, extension 104, and Amy Kitchen will get you connected. And thank you so much, Bez, for sharing today and giving of your precious time. And have a wonderful day. See you next
Thank
time.
you, Kim. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining MetaPod. For requests on topics or to ask questions, you can connect with Ron Crabtree 3 ways: via email at metapod@metaexperts.com, via LinkedIn, or by calling him directly at 734-425-1455, extension 103. Lastly, if you love the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review on your favorite podcast app. We truly appreciate all your support.